The air was heavy, thick with diesel fumes and the scent of wet soil. On a shattered airstrip somewhere in the Pacific, the war had just died, but no one knew how to breathe yet. American Marines stood in loose formation, rifles slung low, boots sinking into mud still slick from last night's rain. Ahead of them, a line of Japanese women, mostly nurses and clerks, emerged from a bamboo hut with hands trembling above their heads. Their khaki uniforms hung loose from hunger. Their eyes were hollow, searching for a sign of mercy that never came during the war. It was late August 1945. The Emperor's voice had already floated across the Pacific, announcing surrender. But these women had not heard it directly, only whispers carried by rumor, like ghosts traveling through static. The silence between captor and captive was thicker than fear itself. Somewhere, a fly buzzed over a fallen helmet. A radio crackled, but no one moved. A Marine Sergeant McAllister from Kentucky stepped forward, his jaw tight, his posture oddly respectful. "We don't shoot nurses," he muttered under his breath, though none of the prisoners understood English. The women flinched anyway. One of them, barely 20, carried a small medical pouch stitched with the Red Sun emblem. It swung with each step like a weight of guilt. Reports would later note that more than 3.5 million Japanese soldiers surrendered after mid-August, but among them only a few hundred were women. For these few, surrender was more terrifying than battle. They had been told that capture meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here they were, breathing, waiting for an order that would define whether they lived another hour. A medic whispered to the sergeant, "What now?" McAllister looked over the line of captives, their faces hidden behind sweat, stained cloth headscarves. The wind shifted, carrying the faint clang of a distant flagpole. He gave the simplest command he could think of, his voice steady but low enough to carry only to them. "Uncover your heads." For a moment no one moved. The women's eyes widened, confusion and dread twisting together. The order seemed harmless, but to them it felt like a stripping away of the last shred of dignity. The stillness turned into a silent standoff, the kind that doesn't need bullets to wound. The hesitation begins here. The command hung in the humid air like an invisible blade. "Uncover your heads." The women froze. Not one moved, not even to breathe. Their cloth scarves, once part of crisp military nurse uniforms, were now grimy, salt, stained, and sacred. Beneath them hid lice bites, shaved patches, and the last fragile veil between shame and exposure. To remove them was not a small act. It was surrender inside surrender. Sergeant McAllister's voice came again, softer this time, but unyielding. "Uncover. It's all right." The interpreter beside him, a nice-eye corporal who spoke hesitant Japanese, repeated the order. The women looked at one another, their lips trembling. One whispered, "Do they want to see our faces or humiliate us?" The words rippled through the line like a gust of dread. In those seconds of paralysis, the Americans stood strangely still. Their rifles pointed down, but the psychological weight of command pressed heavier than steel. The war had taught them to shout orders at men with bayonets, not to speak gently to women in tattered uniforms. The sergeant clenched his jaw, unsure if patience would be mistaken for weakness. Then movement. A single nurse, barely more than a teenager, raised her hands. Her fingers shook as she reached for the knot at the back of her neck. Every eye turned to her. She hesitated, then pulled the scarf away. A gasp escaped from the women beside her. Her hair was gone, shaved by order weeks earlier to prevent lice. Her scalp was blotched and raw. The scene seemed to stretch beyond time. Reports later recorded that over 200 Japanese women POW were processed across the Philippines alone in those final weeks of 1945. Most were trained medics, once disciplined and proud, but in that instant every rank and duty vanished. They were simply human beings stripped of their armor literally and otherwise. The sergeant nodded once, a subtle gesture of approval. "Good," he said quietly, "now the rest." But before anyone else could move, the young nurse's lip quivered. Her eyes glistened. She clutched the scarf against her chest, whispering something too soft to hear. Then her face crumpled. The tears began, not loud, not theatrical, just real. And once one cried, the others followed. The hesitation had broken. The crying was about to begin. The sound began as a whisper, soft sniffles lost beneath the drone of flies and distant surf. Then it swelled, fragile but unstoppable. Tears traced dirt, streaked cheeks as the women stood frozen, scarves clutched to trembling chests. No one had shouted, no one had struck them, yet something inside had broken wider than any wound. One American medic stepped forward instinctively, a canteen dangling from his hand. "Easy," he murmured, though the women could not understand. His boots squelched in the mud. The youngest nurse, the one who'd first obeyed, blinked through tears. Her head bowed, revealing small scabs dotting her scalp, the marks of lice and malnutrition. Under the pale morning light, her humiliation was physical, living, undeniable. These weren't battle scars earned with rifles. These were the wounds of neglect. Reports later estimated that more than 60% of Japanese auxiliary nurses captured across the Pacific suffered from severe malnutrition or infection. The empire had abandoned its daughters long before surrender did. Behind her, another woman pulled at her scarf with shaking fingers. It caught on a hairpin, tore slightly, and for a split second she hesitated, not out of vanity, but fear. Removing it meant more than exposing her head. It meant admitting the war was over. It meant acknowledging defeat so absolute that even identity had no place to hide. McAllister's jaw tightened. He had expected defiance or hysteria, not this quiet collapse. "They're scared," one corporal muttered. "No," McAllister replied, eyes still fixed on them. "They're ashamed." That word lingered, ashamed. It was the emotion he recognized because every soldier, victor or vanquished, knew what it meant to outlive his purpose. From the women's line, a small sob turned into a broken wail. The others followed, sound gathering like a storm, until the airstrip itself seemed to hum with grief. The Marines looked away out of decency or discomfort. Tears and surrender were not in their training manuals. Then one of the women dropped her scarf into the mud. It landed softly, a pale flag in the dirt. The sergeant stared at it, motionless. He didn't bark orders this time, because when one tear fell, 100 followed. And what came next wasn't discipline, it was release. The crying had fully begun. It started like rainfall, uneven, scattered, impossible to stop once begun. The Japanese women wept openly now, shoulders shaking, lips quivering. Their voices trembled in a strange chorus, half apology, half mourning. Mud streaked their uniforms as some fell to their knees. The airstrip, moments ago a military zone, had turned into something closer to a funeral ground. Sergeant McAllister stood frozen. These weren't the enemy soldiers he had trained to fight. These were exhausted, skeletal women who had survived starvation, disease, and orders that had already erased their humanity. "Jesus," a Marine muttered beside him, lowering his rifle. "What the hell are we doing?" No one answered. The sound of crying filled every gap words could not. Reports from Allied POW processing units later noted that in late 1945, an average of 800 Japanese captives arrived at camps every week. But nowhere in those official numbers did they describe this. The collapse of pride so sudden that even the victors felt uneasy watching it. A medic crouched beside one of the nurses, offering a small handkerchief. She flinched at first, then accepted it like it was a sacred relic. We cried not from fear, she would later write in her diary, but from what we had become. Her handwriting was uneven, the ink blotted by tears. A second Marine tried to make a joke under his breath, but his voice cracked. The absurdity of the scene, trained men paralyzed by women's tears, stripped away every layer of battlefield bravado. McAllister rubbed his temple, torn between duty and decency. Then he made a choice. He raised one hand, palm outward, not to command, but to pause. The gesture was enough. The crying softened into quiet sobs. The interpreter, confused, whispered, "What orders, sir?" McAllister exhaled. "Stand down," he said. "They're done fighting." In that moment, authority dissolved. The rifles lowered, the shouting stopped, and the only sound left was the rhythm of quiet weeping blending with the sea breeze. The war, it seemed, had finally ended here, not in Tokyo Bay, not with documents, but in this muddy clearing filled with tears. And, as the sergeant's hand fell to his side, something deeper began, a fragile, wordless peace. For the first time in months, Sergeant McAllister didn't know what to do. He stood there in the sticky Pacific heat, surrounded by men who had fought island to island, and by women who had lost everything except the thin fabric in their hands. The sound of their crying wasn't like anything he'd heard in battle. It wasn't terror. It was exhaustion, grief, and something even harder to name, release. He turned his head slowly, meeting the eyes of his men. Every rifle was lowered now. The enemy had vanished, replaced by people. McAllister took off his helmet, sweat running down his temple. "Easy," he murmured, "they're done fighting." His voice cracked halfway through, and it wasn't command anymore. It was confession. Behind him, a corporal started muttering about protocol. Orders were orders. POW were supposed to be searched, processed, questioned. But the sergeant didn't move. "We'll do that after," he said, voice quiet. "For now, let them be." Later, military reports would describe this as a psychological dominance strategy through calm tone. But anyone who was there knew it wasn't strategy. It was mercy, the kind that doesn't make it into official war records. The women's crying softened. One wiped her face on her sleeve and looked up, startled that the Americans hadn't shouted or mocked her. The contrast was staggering. Their own officers had beaten them for less. Under the Imperial Army, compassion was weakness. Here, silence was strength. An older nurse, her face lined beyond her years, whispered something to the others. They bowed slightly, an instinct born of discipline, but reshaped now by gratitude. McAllister didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He nodded back just once. In that moment, something fragile shifted. The war's machinery had ground to a halt, leaving only human beings standing in the dust. A line had been crossed, not of battlefields, but of empathy. McAllister exhaled, signaling to his men to guide the women toward the medical tent. The sound of boots and shuffling feet replaced the sobs. The canvas flaps ahead swayed in the hot breeze. Inside, the next chapter of this uneasy mercy was waiting, sterile, tense, and quietly human. The tent swallowed them one by one. The world outside still smelled of gun oil and mud, but inside the tent it was antiseptic and quiet. Canvas walls flapped softly, filtering the harsh sunlight into a dim yellow haze. The air carried the sharp sting of iodine and the faint sweetness of morphine. American medics moved in careful silence, gloved hands, measured gestures, eyes that tried not to look too long. The Japanese women sat in a row on rough wooden benches. Their faces were streaked with dried tears and salt, their eyes red but alert. One clutched her scarf, now folded neatly in her lap like a relic of another life. A young U.S. nurse knelt beside her, pressing a damp cloth to a blistered arm. "You're safe," she said softly, though the words meant nothing. The tone, though gentle, unhurried, spoke volumes. These were trained medics themselves, once part of an army that had told them mercy was weakness. Now their captors were washing their wounds. The irony was too large to process. One Japanese woman whispered to another, "They offer water. We expected interrogation." Her voice trembled not from pain, but disbelief. The records would later show that nearly 1/3 of Japanese POW across Southeast Asia received medical treatment from U.S. personnel before being transferred to formal camps. Yet statistics could never capture this, the trembling exchange of human kindness in a place built for war. A medic approached another nurse with a can of condensed milk. She recoiled at first, assuming a trick. He placed it gently on the table and stepped back. "It's food," he said. "You need it." She watched him for a moment, then reached forward, the spoon shaking between her fingers. Her first sip came with a sob. Outside, the muffled rumble of trucks and the clatter of typewriters continued, the machinery of surrender grinding on. But in this tent, the war seemed to pause again. The smell of disinfectant replaced the stench of decay. The sound of boots was replaced by the scrape of tin bowls and faint sighs of relief. When one nurse finally looked up and met the eyes of her American counterpart, something flickered recognition, perhaps even respect. Then the moment passed, swallowed by silence. But that silence was different now. It carried possibility. Night crept in like a sigh through the seams of the canvas tent. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the sticky humidity of the Pacific. Lanterns swung gently overhead, casting thin shadows that danced across weary faces. The women POW sat close together, whispering, watching, trying to understand this strange new captivity that felt nothing like the horror stories they had been told. A tray clattered down onto a wooden table, steaming bowls, slices of pale bread, even a few pieces of canned fruit. One nurse gasped softly. Another reached out, hesitant, touching the edge of the tin bowl as if expecting a blow. But none came. The American guard just nodded once and walked away. "They don't shout." One woman whispered, "They don't hit." The others stared at her, unsure if they should believe what they were seeing. Their own officers had once told them that capture meant violation, starvation, disgrace. Yet here they were being fed, bandaged, spoken to with calm voices instead of screams. Reports later confirmed that prisoners under American custody were provided close to 3,000 calories per day, a staggering contrast to the 900 or fewer that imperial soldiers often received even while still free. The shock was not just physical, it was moral. Everything they'd been told about the enemy cracked like thin glass. A young Marine passed by, carrying a bucket of water. One of the nurses stood, bowing slightly before accepting it. The Marine blinked, awkward but respectful, and offered a small smile. The women murmured among themselves afterward, uncertain whether kindness was a tactic or the truth. As night deepened, the tent filled with soft chewing and quiet conversation. Some of the women tried to mimic English words they'd overheard. A few even laughed small, stifled sounds, like children learning to breathe again. In the silence that followed, the sergeant looked in from outside. He saw them eating, calm, alive. He didn't say a word, just nodded once and left, his boots crunching on gravel. For the first time, the prisoners felt the absence of fear, and it unsettled them more than any weapon ever had. The next morning, gratitude would take shape in an unexpected form. Morning came hazy and gold, filtered through the torn seams of the tent. The camp stirred slowly, pots clanging, boots crunching gravel, engines coughing to life. The women POW lined up outside for roll call, each clutching her scarf, the same piece of fabric that had once been a symbol of discipline and now survival. For the first time, their eyes did not look down. They watched. They studied the men who guarded them, young, sunburnt, tired, and they saw something that looked almost human. After inspection, Sergeant McAllister walked the line, his notebook tucked under his arm. He nodded curtly to the interpreter, then paused beside one of the nurses, the same girl who had first uncovered her head days earlier. Her scarf, now clean and folded, was pressed to her chest like a farewell. Without a word, she stepped forward and extended it toward him. The gesture froze everyone. The Marines shifted uneasily. They weren't trained for this. She kept her hands out, trembling slightly. For her, it was an offering, the only thing she had left to give. McAllister stared at it, understanding without translation. The scarf was no trophy. It was an apology, a bridge, a surrender within surrender. He slowly shook his head. "Keep it," he said softly. She hesitated, confusion flickering across her face. He repeated the gesture with his hands, stepping back. The message was clear, no tribute, no humiliation, just peace. She lowered the scarf and bowed deeply, tears pooling again, but this time different, not despair, but release. Later, in camp records, McAllister would make a brief note. One offered her headcloth, declined respectfully. In years to come, dozens of similar objects, scarves, canteens, small handmade charms, would find their way into U.S. museum archives, silent witnesses to moments like this. None had explanations attached, only catalog numbers and dates. But those who handled them could sense the weight, the invisible story of surrender and dignity intertwined. As the sergeant walked away, murmurs rose among the women. Some saw the gesture as mercy, others as unbearable kindness. That night, as the lanterns dimmed, rumors began that not all camps were like this, that some women elsewhere were not treated so gently, and the peace of the day began to tremble again. The rain returned that night, a thin, steady curtain against the canvas roof. Inside, the women whispered. They huddled close, speaking in half sentences, voices low enough to hide from the guards outside. What began as quiet gratitude slowly shifted into something heavier. One woman, her hands shaking, began to talk about another group of nurses' friends captured not by the Americans, but by the Soviets in Manchuria. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "They didn't come back," she said. The others fell silent. Word had traveled through the camps. In the far north, in the cold barracks of Siberia, Japanese prisoners were disappearing. The numbers were staggering. Reports later confirmed that over 570, 5,000 Japanese, had been captured by Soviet forces. Of those, around 60,000 were never seen again. Frostbite, hunger, forced labor, death disguised as discipline. For the women listening in that tent, the knowledge landed like a physical blow. They were alive because of luck, not virtue. The Americans, with their rations and calm voices, were supposed to be monsters. Yet the true cruelty, it seemed, had come from those who once called themselves allies. A young nurse, her eyes still swollen from days of tears, muttered, "We were lucky to be their prisoners." The others nodded silently, the words tasting bitter in their mouths. Luck was a strange shield in war. It protected you, but it also accused you. Why you survived when others didn't. Outside, a guard lit a cigarette, its ember glowing briefly through the rain. The faint smell of tobacco drifted in, oddly comforting. For a fleeting moment the women felt safe. Then guilt crept in to replace it, slow and heavy. The irony was cruel. They had been raised to believe capture was worse than death, that surrender was shame eternal. Yet now the opposite seemed true. The ones who lived might have chosen the harder fate. One of the nurses clasped her scarf again, whispering into the fabric like a prayer. "Forgive us," she said softly, though she wasn't sure who she meant, the dead or the living. The guilt would spread like the rain seeping, relentless and impossible to dry. Sleep came in fragments that night. The tent was filled with shallow breathing, soft sobs, and the quiet rustle of restless bodies. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a stillness that made every sound sharper, the flap of wet canvas, the distant hum of engines, the rhythmic chirp of crickets. But inside their minds the noise never stopped. One nurse sat awake, her eyes wide in the dark. She whispered to no one, "Why didn't we die like the others?" The words floated between the bunks, heavy as lead. Another woman turned away, biting her lip until she tasted blood. Survival, once unthinkable, had become unbearable. The Empire had trained them to embrace death as honor, surrender as shame. Now, in this alien safety, that training twisted inward. They had food, medicine, and mercy, but none of it erased the question gnawing at their hearts. What right did we have to live? Diaries recovered years later would show entries like this one. To live is to betray. To cry is to remember. The handwriting trembled, the ink bleeding through cheap paper. Studies from that era estimated suicide rates among Japanese POW rose by over 12% after surrender, a silent epidemic of guilt that no treaty could heal. In the dim light of dawn, one of the women pressed her forehead to the dirt floor. She whispered the names of her fallen unit, each syllable breaking her voice. The others watched, unsure whether to join or stay silent. Even grief had become a foreign language. Sergeant McAllister passed by outside, unaware of the turmoil behind the tent's walls. He saw calm where there was collapse, quiet where there was chaos. To him they looked peaceful, to them peace felt like punishment. The sun crept up, bleeding light through the seams of canvas. The women began to rise, faces drawn, movements mechanical. A few tried to straighten their uniforms, small gestures of control in a world that had stripped them of everything else. But when the morning air brushed their faces, something inside shifted again. The guilt didn't vanish, it transformed. What began as shame started to look like something else entirely, the first fragile trace of understanding. The first light slipped through the slits in the canvas, turning the dust in the air into golden smoke. The women stirred slowly, eyes swollen, muscles aching. For the first time, the sound of laughter, low, rough, human, drifted in from outside. The American guards were joking near the supply truck, trading words they couldn't understand, but whose tone carried warmth instead of command. One nurse peeked through the flap, curiosity edging past fear. A young Marine sat on an ammo crate, offering a cigarette to another soldier. When their match refused to light, Both laughed, the kind of laugh that belonged to peacetime. She watched in silence, confused by how simple it looked, this act of normal life. Moments later, the same Marine noticed her gaze. He held up a spare cigarette, gesturing awkwardly. "Want one?" The woman flinched, unsure. Then, hesitantly, she stepped forward. He lit it for her, careful not to come too close. Smoke curled upward between them, carrying away the last scent of iodine and fear. For a heartbeat, there was no victor or captive, just two exhausted people sharing silence. Later records mention that over 4,000 Japanese POW eventually worked alongside Allied medics in post-war operations, translating, organizing supplies, even treating patients. It wasn't politics. It was survival reshaped into purpose. Inside the tent, another nurse mimicked the Marine's laughter, clumsy and uncertain. The sound startled her companions. Then, one by one, they joined soft giggles at first, turning into genuine laughter that felt foreign in their throats. The tension cracked open, replaced by something fragile yet real, connection. A line from one woman's post-war letter captures it best. They were not devils. They were men who missed home. When McAllister walked past later that morning, he saw the group smiling, even playing with a stray camp dog that had wandered in. He said nothing, just tipped his helmet slightly, a gesture halfway between salute and goodbye. The war outside had already ended, but inside this small circle of strangers, something else had begun understanding, born not from speeches, but from shared exhaustion. And as the sun climbed higher, it revealed a question they hadn't dared ask until now. What happens after mercy? Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the camp began to slow. The guards had stopped counting hours. The women had stopped counting days. One afternoon, a soldier arrived carrying a wooden crate filled with paper, pencils, and small envelopes. "Letters," the interpreter explained, his voice hesitant, almost apologetic. "You can write home now." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, the Japanese nurses reached forward, fingertips brushing the fragile sheets as though they might vanish. Most hadn't held a pencil since before the bombings. The paper smelled faintly of salt and ink, strange luxuries after months of grime and hunger. They sat in silence, hunched over the makeshift tables. The first few lines came haltingly, stiff with disbelief. "We are alive. We are treated kindly. They feed us." The words looked foreign even to them. How do you explain survival to those who were taught death was the only honorable end? Records show that by 1946, Allied censors logged more than 50,000 Japanese POW letters worldwide, each one filtered, stamped, and archived before being sent home. Many were never delivered, but the act of writing was the point. It was proof of existence. One nurse paused mid-sentence, the pencil shaking. She looked at the young Marine standing watch near the tent flap. McAllister. He caught her gaze, gave a small nod. She lowered her head again and wrote carefully, "They let us live." Outside, typewriters clicked, trucks idled, and seagulls circled above the distant shore. Life somehow had resumed. Inside, the scratching of pencils became its own kind of hymn, a quiet chorus of survivors documenting the unthinkable. When the letters were collected, McAllister carried the bundle himself to the command post. He thumbed through one envelope just for a second, tracing the faint indentations of kanji beneath his calloused fingers. He couldn't read it, but he didn't need to. He understood its weight. That night, the women slept soundly for the first time since capture. The fear hadn't vanished. It had simply grown quieter, replaced by the small, steady heartbeat of hope. And as dawn crept in again, McAllister opened one letter of his own, from home. It was signed simply, "Stay Human." Repatriation morning came with the rumble of trucks and the smell of diesel carried on ocean wind. The war was over, officially and irreversibly, but the weight of it still clung to everything: the uniforms, the sand, even the sky. Along the pier, rows of Japanese women POWs stood in silence, clutching small bundles of belongings, scarves, letters, a few trinkets saved from captivity. Their faces were thin, their eyes clearer than they had been in months. American soldiers moved among them, checking lists, stamping forms. Sergeant McAllister stood at the end of the line, his helmet tilted back, sleeves rolled. He'd seen countless departures, men shipped home, prisoners transferred, but this one felt different. He watched as each woman stepped forward, bowed slightly, and boarded the transport trucks bound for the ships. When the nurse who had first uncovered her head approached him, she stopped. For a moment neither spoke. Then she unfolded her scarf, creased, faded but still intact, and tied it around her neck. No fear this time. No hesitation. Her head remained uncovered by choice. She bowed deeply. McAllister nodded once, unable to find words that fit the gravity of the moment. Reports later showed that by 1947, more than 95% of Japanese POW had been repatriated. Most returned to cities reduced to ash, to families who barely recognized them, to a nation trying to remember how to live. But for this small group of women, their return carried something unseen in statistics: dignity reclaimed, piece by piece, across the Pacific. A medic snapped a final photograph as the trucks began to roll. The women looked straight ahead, wind tugging at their hair, faces calm but unreadable. Behind them the American flag fluttered at half-mast. Ahead, the Japanese flag waited in silence on a distant ship. As the last truck pulled away, McAllister stood alone on the pier. The sea hissed against the rocks, gulls circling overhead. At his feet lay something half buried in the dust, a forgotten scarf, its fabric rippling in the wind. He bent, picked it up, and stared for a long time before folding it neatly into his pocket. "They ordered us to uncover our heads," he murmured, watching the horizon, "and somehow taught us how to stand again."